I knew exactly who Captain Arthur Vance was long before the heavy cockpit door clicked shut behind me, sealing us in for a 14-hour flight over the Pacific. Everybody in the aviation industry did. Arthur was the airline's golden boy. Millions of followers on his aviation vlog, brand deals with luxury watchmakers, magazine covers, passengers practically screaming his name every time he walked through the terminal in his immaculate four-stripe uniform. The kind of guy people automatically stared at when he walked into a room. So when I pushed open the door to the pre-flight briefing center at Seattle Tacoma and saw Arthur sitting near the window, casually scrolling through his tablet with a coffee in hand, my grip on my flight bag tightened so hard my knuckles went white. He looked up. His striking blue eyes scanned me for a second before a lazy, devastatingly confident grin spread across his face. "Please tell me you are my new first officer and not another safety inspector," he said. I cleared my throat awkwardly. "First Officer Julian Hayes." "Well, thank God." Arthur stood and offered his hand. "Arthur," as if I did not already know that. I shook his hand quickly. His grip was warm and incredibly strong, the kind of handshake that lingered just a fraction of a second too long. I pulled away first and immediately started organizing my navigational charts, mostly so I would not keep staring at his broad shoulders like a complete idiot. Before we get too deep into this flight, I have a quick question for you guys listening. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see where my passengers on this journey are tuning in from. It always amazes me how far these stories reach. Anyway, back to the briefing room. 6 months. That was how long this specific long-haul pairing schedule would last before the winter route reshuffle. 6 months sharing incredibly tight cockpit spaces and cramped crew rest bunks with the most attractive man I had ever seen in real life. It was a terrible situation for someone like me. I had spent years learning how to survive quietly in this industry. At my last airline, a nasty rumor about another pilot being gay had spread through the crew lounges like a wildfire, and I still remembered the jokes, the casual insults, the raw disgust in people's voices over the radio frequencies. Ever since then, I kept everything locked down completely tight. No dating, no flirting, absolutely zero risk. And now fate had assigned me to the right seat next to Arthur Vance. By the second day of our pairing, Arthur acted like we had been flying together for a decade. He talked constantly over the headset during cruise altitude. He talked about annoying corporate sponsors, about aviation geeks stalking him outside layover hotels, about how much he hated the dry airline food. I mostly listened, adjusting the autopilot dials and pretending not to notice how good his voice sounded through the noise-canceling headphones. The worst part was how comfortable Arthur was physically. In the tiny space of the flight deck, he invaded my personal bubble constantly. He would lean right over my shoulder to tap the navigation display, his chest brushing my arm. He changed his uniform shirt in the narrow crew rest area without a single care in the world, leaving me staring at the bulkhead wall. "You are incredibly quiet," Arthur said one night, as we cruised at 35,000 feet over the dark Atlantic. The cockpit was illuminated only by the soft green glow of the instrument panels. "I monitor the radios," I replied flatly. "Someone has to." He let out a loud, rich laugh. "Half the cabin crew thinks you hate everybody on board." I snorted softly, adjusting my headset. "Maybe I do." "See, that is the most personality you have shown all week." Arthur pointed a finger at me dramatically. "You actually possess human emotions under that perfectly ironed collar." The truly annoying thing was that Arthur was not fake. I expected massive arrogance from someone with that much fame, but he treated everybody exactly the same. The baggage handlers, the junior flight attendants, the gate agents, even me, a first officer who had arrived at this premium route with zero reputation. 3 weeks into our schedule, we caught a brutal winter storm out of Anchorage. The sky turned into a violent wall of black clouds and ice. The aircraft shook violently, throwing us against our shoulder harnesses. Arthur was flying manually, wrestling the heavy yoke. He looked unstoppable, completely in his element. Then, right as we broke through the worst of the cloud layer, I noticed it. Arthur lost his grip on the yoke for half a second. His breathing hitched. His eyes darted rapidly around the glowing instruments, and his skin turned pale gray. It only lasted a moment before he grabbed the controls again, but I saw it clearly. He was leaning entirely to the left, completely disoriented, misreading the artificial horizon. He was losing his spatial balance. After we landed safely and the passengers disembarked, the crew headed toward the terminal, laughing about the rough ride. I slowed down near the jet bridge. Arthur lingered behind, leaning heavily against the cold metal wall, rubbing his temples. "You have vertigo," I said quietly. Arthur froze completely. Then he forced his trademark smile. "I am perfectly fine, Julian. You lost your balance up there. You experienced severe spatial disorientation." "No, I did not." I stared at him. He stared back, his jaw tight, before he let out a heavy, ragged sigh. "Okay, maybe a slight dizzy spell. How bad is it?" I asked, stepping closer. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking around to ensure the jet bridge was empty. "Not bad enough to lose my medical clearance." That answer told me everything. Arthur leaned closer, lowering his voice until it was barely a whisper. "If the aviation medical examiners think I have a chronic inner ear issue, they will ground me permanently. My flying career is over. I cannot let that happen." "You should still get a doctor to look at it," I insisted. "I know." Arthur looked incredibly exhausted, the lines around his eyes suddenly visible under the harsh terminal lights. "Just do not log it in the report yet, okay?" I hesitated. Every logical, self-preserving thought in my brain screamed at me to stay out of it, to report him, to follow the manual. But then Arthur added quietly, "Please, Julian." And I was doomed the exact second I agreed. That night in the layover hotel in Tokyo, rain lashed against the massive glass windows. Arthur knocked on my door at midnight. He walked in looking completely drained and collapsed onto the small armchair in the corner of my room. "I think my career is dying," he mumbled, staring at the floor. I walked into the bathroom, grabbed a glass of water, and handed it to him. "You flew a massive aircraft through a Category 3 storm system. Your inner ear took a beating." Arthur turned his head slightly. Zero compassion from my first officer. None. I rolled my eyes but sat on the edge of the bed opposite him. "I need to run a manual balance test on you," I said, relying on some old aeromedical training my father had taught me. "Stand up, close your eyes, lift your arms." Arthur stood slowly. For a few minutes, neither of us talked. The hotel room was completely silent except for the heavy rain hitting the glass. As I guided his arms, stabilizing his shoulders when he swayed, my hands rested against his warm muscles. He breathed out slowly. "You know how to calm people down pretty well," Arthur murmured, his eyes still closed. "Well, congratulations. You are officially my favorite co-pilot in the fleet now." A sharp heat flared in my chest at his low voice. Over the next month, it became our secret routine: late-night balance checks in empty hotel rooms across the globe, me guiding him through sensory recalibration exercises. I told myself it was strictly professional, just keeping my captain in the air. But deep down, I knew the terrifying truth. I liked taking care of Arthur way too much. One night in London, after an incredibly stressful delay on the tarmac, we sat in the empty hotel bar. The bartender had already wiped down the counters and left us alone. Arthur sat on the stool next to me, tracing the rim of his glass. "Why do you never talk about whoever is waiting for you at home?" he asked suddenly. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like a rapid descent. "What? You never mentioned dating anyone." Arthur studied my face carefully. Not really focused on that, I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the damp coaster. You ever been in love? The question felt incredibly dangerous in the dimly lit room. I shrugged casually, forcing my muscles to relax. Not really. Arthur nodded slowly, though something about his expression shifted, his eyes darkening as they traced the line of my jaw. Well, he said softly, whoever finally gets you is going to be incredibly lucky. I almost knocked my drink over. That night was the first time I genuinely panicked about how completely obvious my feelings might become, so I started avoiding him. Nothing dramatic. I just stayed in my hotel room during layovers, skipped our morning coffees, kept cockpit conversations strictly about altitudes and fuel consumption. Arthur noticed immediately. 4 days later, he cornered me in the narrow galley at the back of the aircraft while the passengers slept. Okay, what is your actual problem? He demanded, standing entirely too close. I do not have a problem, Captain. You have barely looked at me for 3 days. I have been calculating fuel weight. Arthur crossed his arms, his biceps stretching the fabric of his uniform. That is garbage. I looked around nervously, pulling the galley curtain shut. Can we not do this at 30,000 feet? He stared at me, then grabbed my wrist, pulling me into the tiny, soundproof crew rest compartment. The door clicked shut, plunging us into dim, amber light. Did I do something wrong? The genuine confusion and hurt in his voice made me feel instantly guilty. No. Then why are you acting like I am a stranger? Because I am falling for you. Because every time you look at me in that pilot seat, my lungs forget how to pull in air. Because this entire situation is a career-ending disaster waiting to happen. Instead of saying any of that, I just let out a harsh breath. You are too intense, Arthur. You never leave people alone. Arthur laughed softly, stepping closer in the cramped space. You want me to back off? I opened my mouth automatically to say yes, but the words simply died in my throat. Arthur looked strangely serious suddenly. Not joking, not his confident public persona, just waiting, watching my lips. And I realized something absolutely terrifying. He actually cared what my answer would be. I did not say that, I admitted, my voice shaking slightly. His expression softened instantly. Good. For a long second, neither of us moved. The dull roar of the jet engines vibrated through the floorboards. Then Arthur swayed slightly, pressing a hand to his temple. Your balance again? I asked, reaching out instinctively. Yeah, he cursed under his breath. Sit down on the bunk, I commanded. He obeyed surprisingly fast. I knelt in front of him in the narrow aisle, placing my hands firmly on his knees to ground him. Just focus on a fixed point. Look at me. Arthur looked down at me quietly. His breathing slowed as he stared into my eyes. You always take care of everybody like this, Julian. Just dizzy pilots, I muttered. He smiled, a soft, private smile I had never seen on his vlog. I started to pull my hands away, but before I could move, Arthur caught my wrist gently. The touch sent a violent shock through my entire nervous system. He looked completely exhausted, vulnerable in a way the world never saw. Why do I feel so much calmer when you are right here? He whispered. My pulse hammered wildly against his fingers, and for the first time since boarding this aircraft, I realized this was no longer just a dangerous crush. Something massive between us was shifting. By the 4th month, my entire life revolved around Arthur Vance. Not intentionally, but somehow every flight ended exactly the same way. Arthur sitting on the edge of a hotel bed while I walked him through grounding techniques. Arthur complaining dramatically about corporate meetings while leaning his head against the back of my chair. You realize this makes us look like an old married couple, right? Arthur joked one night while we ate instant ramen in a deserted crew lounge in Dubai. I did not look up from my flight manual. You complain way too much to be anyone's husband. That physically hurts, Julian. You will survive. Arthur grinned lazily, stretching his legs out. You are still nicer than anyone else in this company. That part surprised me deeply. Arthur had thousands of adoring fans, flight attendants constantly fighting for his attention, executives praising his every move. But late at night, he spoke like a man who felt completely isolated. And I was rapidly becoming the only place where he could finally strip off the armor. It happened progressively. He stopped going out with the senior captains and started dragging me to empty airport observation decks at 2 in the morning. We would sit on the cold floor, watching cargo planes land, sharing stale vending machine sandwiches. Sometimes he would lie flat on the terminal carpet, staring at the ceiling, while I sat beside him explaining aerodynamic theory, just to keep his mind off the vertigo. You overthink absolutely everything, he said one night. That is because someone in that cockpit has to. Arthur pointed at his own chest proudly. I fly the plane. Thinking is your department. I rolled my eyes, but I was smiling before I could stop myself. That became incredibly dangerous, too, because Arthur noticed everything. The smiles, the nervous swallows, the way my shoulders relaxed only when he was near. And once he noticed, he started chasing those small reactions relentlessly. A few weeks later, everything fractured after a terrible PR event in New York. The airline had forced Arthur to do a live press conference, and the reporters tore him apart, accusing him of prioritizing his social media fame over aviation safety after a minor runway incident that was not even his fault. I noticed him acting unusually quiet during the taxi to the runway. On the long flight back to Seattle, he handed control over to the relief pilot and locked himself in the crew rest bunk. Around 3 in the morning, I opened the heavy door to check on him. The small compartment was pitch black. Arthur? I whispered. I heard him breathing way too fast. Panicked, shallow gasps. I turned on the low red emergency light. Arthur was sitting on the floor, his knees pulled to his chest, shaking violently. I dropped to my knees immediately. Arthur, look at me. He shook his head, burying his face in his hands. I can't breathe, he choked out, his voice cracking. My heart slammed against my ribs. I moved closer, keeping my voice perfectly level. Okay, focus on the vibration of the floor. Match your breathing to my voice. I can't, Julian. I am screwing everything up. The company is furious. Everyone expects me to be this perfect hero of the sky, and my head is spinning constantly. He grabbed his own hair in frustration. I am so tired. That raw admission destroyed my defenses completely. Without a second thought, I slid closer and wrapped my arms firmly around his shaking shoulders. He froze instantly. For one horrifying second, I thought I had crossed an unforgivable line. Then Arthur collapsed into my chest. He leaned into me heavily, burying his face in my neck, gripping the fabric of my uniform shirt like he was drowning. I sat there on the cold floor of the aircraft, holding him tight while we soared at 40,000 feet. Minutes bled away. Eventually, his breathing steadied. Neither of us pulled away. His forehead rested against my collarbone. His hand remained tightly fisted in my shirt. Sorry, he mumbled weakly against my skin. Do not apologize, I whispered. You deal with the weight of the whole airline every single day. Yeah, but this is different. How? Arthur lifted his head slowly. The space between us was non-existent, because nobody sees the real me except you. The air in the tiny compartment suddenly felt dangerously heavy. His blue eyes dropped slowly to my mouth. He swallowed hard. I stopped breathing entirely. Then, Arthur scrambled backward, standing up so fast he hit his head on the low ceiling. "I should go check the instruments," he stammered. The fragile moment shattered into a million pieces. The next week was sheer agony, a minefield of tiny, unspoken moments. Arthur sitting way too close during weather briefings. Arthur reaching across the center console and letting his knuckles drag across my thigh. Then came the annual aviation gala in Paris. The company flew the senior crew out for a massive PR event. Officially, it was an award ceremony. Unofficially, it was a nightmare of flashing cameras and fake smiles. The first night, I escaped the crowded ballroom after an hour of suffocating small talk. I walked out onto the grand stone balcony overlooking the illuminated Eiffel Tower. The crisp night air felt amazing. 10 minutes later, heavy footsteps approached. Arthur leaned against the stone railing beside me, handing me a glass of champagne. "You vanished," he noted, loosening his silk tie. "You were surrounded by executives and supermodels." "Yeah, that is exactly when I want to vanish too," he replied softly. I glanced at him. The golden lights of Paris reflected in his eyes. He looked devastatingly handsome, but completely exhausted. "Do you ever get tired of pretending to be someone else?" Arthur asked quietly. My chest tightened painfully. "What do you mean?" "People think they know Captain Vance," he laughed without a shred of humor. "But I feel like I am acting a role every second of my life." I understood that specific torture perfectly. "You get it, don't you?" Arthur looked at me deeply. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Yeah, I do." We stood there as the city hummed below us. Then Arthur stepped closer. Not rushed, just a deliberate shift until his shoulder pressed warmly against mine. "I only feel normal when I am with you, Julian." The gala ended the next night. Arthur received the highest aviator award. The ballroom erupted in applause. Cameras flashed blindingly. But as he walked off the stage, holding the heavy glass trophy, his eyes frantically scanned the dark edges of the room. He was looking for me. I had retreated to a quiet, empty corridor near the kitchens to avoid the crowd. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors pushed open. Arthur walked in, breathing heavily, and firmly locked the door behind him. My pulse skyrocketed. The muffled bass of the ballroom music pounded through the walls. "Arthur?" He stepped closer, dropping the expensive trophy onto a linen-covered table without looking at it. "You know what the hardest part of all this is?" he asked, his voice rough. I could not speak. "Every time something good happens out there," he pointed vaguely toward the doors, "you are the only person I want to find." He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the faint scent of rain. "You are the only thing in my life that feels real." And then Arthur kissed me, slow, desperate, like he was terrified I might push him away. But I didn't. The moment his warm hand cupped my jaw, years of rigid fear and discipline completely shattered. I kissed him back instantly, my hands grabbing the lapels of his tuxedo jacket. Arthur let out a ragged breath against my mouth, a sound of pure relief, and pulled my body flush against his. The kiss deepened wildly. We stumbled back slightly until my shoulders hit the wall. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing heavily. Arthur rested his forehead against mine, keeping his eyes closed. "Do not let me run away from this," he whispered fiercely. For a few glorious weeks, I genuinely believed we could survive. We slipped into a secret, intoxicating routine. Arthur stealing my coffee in the briefing rooms, me fixing his crooked collar before his vlog recordings. Late nights in foreign hotel rooms, tangled in the sheets, watching the city lights. One afternoon on a crew bus in Frankfurt, we were stuck in terrible traffic. I was in the back row reviewing charts. Arthur dropped into the seat beside me, letting his leg press heavily against mine. "I am exhausted," he whispered, leaning his head directly onto my shoulder. "Arthur," I hissed under my breath, "there are 20 crew members on this bus." He closed his eyes. "Let them look." For a few terrifying minutes, he stayed there. I saw 2 flight attendants glancing at us in the rearview mirror, whispering. That cold dread settled in my stomach. That night, I confronted him. "People are noticing, Arthur." He sat on the bed, unlacing his shoes. "Does it bother you?" I rubbed my face defensively. "I just know how fast this industry turns ugly. I am not going to let anyone touch you," he promised smoothly. A week later, the nightmare happened. We were walking through the bustling terminal in Dubai. Arthur was furious about a scheduling change. He looked completely stressed. Without thinking, I reached out and gently squeezed his lower back to calm him. For a fraction of a second, he leaned into my touch. A massive flash went off. A paparazzi hiding near a pillar got the shot. Arthur's face drained of color. "Oh God," he breathed. The photo hit the aviation blogs and tabloids by morning. Secret romance on the flight deck? The picture was slightly blurry, but my hand on his waist was unmistakable. The internet exploded. Passengers debated it. Other pilots mocked him openly on forums. People quickly identified me. My phone flooded with hate messages, slurs, threats to revoke my license. Arthur stormed into our layover hotel room, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. "I am going to destroy whoever took that picture," he yelled, pacing like a caged animal. "Arthur, stop. This is insane. They are acting like we crashed a plane." I sat quietly on the bed. Underneath his explosive anger, Arthur looked absolutely terrified. The next afternoon, the airline executives intervened. Arthur was pulled into a 4-hour emergency meeting with PR managers and union reps. When he finally walked into my room later, his eyes were completely hollow. "What happened?" I stood up instantly. He dropped his flight bag. "They want me to fly with a different first officer, just until the rumors die down." Total silence filled the room. "And what did you tell them?" I asked quietly. He looked away. That told me everything. "It is only temporary, Julian. Just a few weeks." I let out a dry, broken laugh. "Wow." "Julian, please listen." "No, it is perfectly fine." I stepped back, the cold reality freezing my blood. "I understand exactly how it is." He ran his hands aggressively through his hair. "You do not understand the corporate pressure right now. I am trying to save both of our careers." "No," I shook my head slowly, staring at the stranger in front of me. "You are trying to save your legendary image." Arthur flinched as if I had struck him. "That is completely unfair. What do you want from me? Do you want me to hold a press conference and announce I am in love with my first officer?" The word hung in the air like a detonated bomb. In love. Neither of us had dared to say it. My chest tore open. But instead of joy, I felt pure heartbreak, because he sounded disgusted by the idea. I spent the next 2 days in agony. Arthur kept his distance perfectly. He barely looked at me during the final flight home. When we landed in Seattle, I walked into the crew locker room and heard the chief pilot talking to another captain near the coffee machine. "All I am saying," the chief pilot muttered, "is Vance needs to drop this weird drama before the board reviews his contract." I stopped dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. I turned around, walked into the locker room, and grabbed my bags. That night, I broke. Arthur came to my apartment to drop off a flight manual. He walked in and stopped dead. My suitcases were open on the floor. I was packing my uniforms. "What are you doing?" he asked, panic leaking into his voice. "I am requesting a permanent transfer to the European Cargo Division." I folded a shirt methodically. No, he stepped forward. You do not get to decide that. I cannot do this anymore, Arthur. I zipped the bag sharply. He fell to his knees in front of my suitcase, grabbing my hands. Julian, please, we will figure this out. When? I shouted, my voice cracking violently. After the board meetings? After the sponsors calm down? After you are finally not ashamed to be standing next to me? I am not ashamed of you. Then why do I feel like your dirty little secret? That question destroyed him. He looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. I pulled my hands away. I spent my entire career hiding who I am just to survive in this uniform. I am not doing it again for a man who is terrified of loving me. Arthur's eyes filled with tears, but I grabbed my coat and walked out into the freezing Seattle rain before he could say another word. I drove to the airport cargo terminal. My transfer flight left in 3 hours. I stood on the desolate observation deck near the cargo bays, letting the freezing rain soak through my jacket. The runway lights blurred into glowing streaks. I was leaving everything behind. Suddenly, the heavy metal door of the deck banged open. Footsteps slammed against the steel grating. I turned. Arthur stood there. He was completely drenched, his expensive uniform ruined, his chest heaving. The sheer panic on his face shifted into violent relief the second he saw me. There you are. Go back to the terminal, Arthur. He shook his head fiercely and marched through the pouring rain until he was inches from my face. I have been running through this entire airport looking for you. You found me. Now leave. For several seconds he just stood there, rainwater streaming down his face, struggling to breathe. Then, with a shattered, broken voice, he spoke. I can survive losing my wings, Julian. I looked up. His blue eyes were overflowing with tears, mixing with the rain. But I cannot survive losing you. The words slammed into my chest, knocking the air out of my lungs. For the first time since the flash of that camera, I saw something infinitely stronger than fear in Arthur Vance. I saw a choice. I am done hiding, he whispered fiercely, stepping closer. I spent my whole life becoming the perfect pilot, the perfect idol. He let out a harsh sob. And I am completely exhausted. I love you, Julian, and I am sick of acting like that is a crime. My vision blurred with hot tears. He reached out with trembling hands, terrified I would pull away. But I stepped forward and grabbed him by the lapels, pulling him down into a desperate, crushing kiss. He wrapped his arms around my waist, lifting me slightly off the wet steel deck, holding me like a lifeline. The next morning was absolute chaos. The airline executives demanded a meeting. Arthur walked into the glass boardroom, held my hand under the mahogany table, and calmly told the board that if they had an issue with his partner, they could accept his immediate resignation. The executives sat in stunned silence. Nobody wanted to lose the face of the airline. They backed down. 2 days later, we flew a massive new flagship route to London. The terminal was packed with aviation bloggers, news cameras, and cheering crowds waiting for Arthur's departure speech. The flashing lights were blinding. I stood quietly near the boarding desk, holding my flight bag, expecting Arthur to do his usual solo PR wave. Instead, Arthur stopped right in the middle of the terminal concourse. He turned around, walked directly over to me, dropped his bags, and took my face in both his hands. Right in front of hundreds of cameras, he kissed me passionately. The terminal went completely silent for 1 second before the crowd erupted. Cameras fired off like strobe lights. Some people gasped, but most cheered wildly. Arthur pulled back, resting his forehead against mine, smiling so brightly the room seemed to fade. 2 years later, we are both captains flying the European routes. Life is not perfectly smooth. There are still hateful comments online, Still moments of intense pressure. But one night, on a snowy layover in Zurich, Arthur asked me to marry him on a quiet, frozen balcony. I said yes before he could even finish the sentence. Love did not make our lives easier, but it made us brave. The man who feared losing his perfect image became the man willing to lose the sky for me. And the pilot who spent his life hiding in the background finally found the one place he was fully, truly seen. Thank you all for listening to this story. I want to know what you think. Would you have risked your entire career for love, or would you have walked away? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories like this one. I will see you in the next video.